非常感谢，早上好，我会说，我会用英语，因为现在在欧洲，So this is part of a larger project on Karl Jaspers, who is generally quite well known but little studied recently. But he has been extremely important, not only as a philosopher, but also as a public intellectual, playing a role that's similar to Jean-Paul Sartre in France, especially in the post-World War II period in Germany. So let me only mention four of the major publications that had a lasting impact on what I call the normative foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany. So the 1923 publication that I will focus on today, on the idea of the modern university, has helped to basically set up and reform the university system in Germany. And then the 1946 publication on the question of German guilt has been the major starting point of working through German responsibilities during the Holocaust and the Second World War. And then in 1949, only 3 years later, you have the perhaps most well-known publication on the origin and goal of history by Jaspers that has started and continues to have an influence in comparative intercultural philosophy by developing the concept of the axial age, the assumption that there has been a cultural breakthrough in the 5th century before the Common Era in different cultural centers in China, India, Persia, and the Near East, so Israel. And then the 1961 publication on the atomic bomb and the future of humanity, one of the first book-length philosophical engagements with the new challenges that have emerged with this new technology of the atomic bomb that now gains some attention again with the new war or wars that we are encountering in Ukraine and Gaza, and the threat of atomic powers confronting each other emerges, unfortunately, again some 70 years after the publication, or 64 years after the publication of this book. I also think that it's quite worthwhile revisiting Jaspers in the context of some of these debates that emerged following these four book publications, because I think he is an important alternative to the much better known and studied Heidegger. So especially today I will engage with Jaspers' philosophy of education, which can be read as an alternative to Heidegger's engagement, especially during the 1930s with his well-known Rektoratsrede, or address to the German nation as the rector of Freiburg University on May 27th, 1933. And on June 30th, Heidegger's speech on the university in the new Reich, in the new empire. So here we see that Jaspers develops a radically different idea to the role that a modern university should be having. Let me start. The modern university system has its historical roots in ancient Greece, with the foundation of the Platonic Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, and then centers of scholastic education emerged during the Middle Ages, well known, the first European university foundations during the Renaissance in Italy with, in the year 1088, the foundation of Bologna University, the oldest European university, then Sorbonne in the 12th century, Oxford in the 13th century, and then the northern German and Czech universities in Prague, 1348. In Cologne, the first public or city-run university in 1388. And in the modern age, universities have significantly expanded their scope and function. Wilhelm von Humboldt defended the ideal of moving beyond the scholastic university model that was established in the Middle Ages and in these first university foundations, and institutionalizing the independent and reflective pursuit of knowledge in the areas of the natural science as well as the human or literal spiritual sciences, Geisteswissenschaften. So the modern university was to contribute to an individual capacity to, in Humboldt's words, embed ourselves in the world. And this Humboldt model became then guiding for the new university foundations, including the main Chinese university foundations, with Peking University in 1898, Fudan in 1905, Tongji following the German medical school model in 1907, shortly afterwards, and Tsinghua in 1911. Despite the nominal success of the Humboldt model of whole-person education within a research university, many of his pedagogical ideals have been overshadowed in favor of an exclusive focus on professional education and the creation, transmission, and display of discipline-specific knowledge. As a result, the original vocation of the modern university education to foster a combination of spiritual cultivation or geistliche Erziehung and the disinterested pursuit of truth has been increasingly overshadowed by the fragmented education of professionals. In this talk, I will briefly reconstruct the normative pillars behind the idea of the modern university as it has been conceived by three of its intellectual founders, namely Kant, Humboldt, and then the main interlocutor, Jaspers. In the second part, I will turn to two case studies, namely Confucian academies in China and the mindfulness movement in the West. Both movements aim to reintegrate spirituality within a modern university curriculum, but often do so within a curriculum that fails to engage with spiritual traditions in an intellectual, responsible, and cosmopolitan manner. By way of conclusion, I will offer preliminary reflections on the potential role that universities with a religious affiliation, especially Jesuit universities where I now work, so this is in a part engaging with my own new university affiliation, even though I'm not a Jesuit and do not come from this tradition. I will briefly address how they could play, what role they could play in reintegrating spiritual cultivation following Humboldt's original idea and Jaspers' modernization of this idea within a modern university curriculum. So, in his pedagogic and institution-critical writings, Immanuel Kant, initially a professor of pedagogy at the University of Königsberg, argues for the education of autonomous citizens that make use of their own reason. Modern education must be committed to a cosmopolitan education to advance, in Kant's terms, world citizenship or Weltbürgertum. The argument for cosmopolitan institutions of higher learning is straightforward. Kant perceived that parents primarily care for their own children at the expense of contributing to the greater good of society. Moreover, governments do not have an interest in cultivating world citizens, but tend to form subjects into instruments to advance their partisan national purposes. Modern education, Kant thus concluded, must serve a corrective function to counteract these two tendencies, leading to a de facto narrowing of educational horizons. He was convinced that university education had to be freed from the limiting educational visions of both parents and governments alike. As autonomous cosmopolitan institutions, modern universities must create a balance to the natural inclination of parents to privilege their own children and the attempt by governments to limit the educational horizons of their citizens. Quote, "The design for a plan of education must be made in a cosmopolitan manner." It is no secret that Kant's cosmopolitanism had its own limits, of course, especially when applied to concrete cases. While he does try to reach beyond European frames of reference in his writings on anthropology, religion, and world history, his observations are shaped by Eurocentric and at times even racist ideas. Thus, he, for example, dismissed the potential contributions of spiritual practices coming from outside of a Christian context and objective fiercely against non-European religions and philosophical traditions. To take an example, in The End of All Things, he writes about Chinese meditative practices connected to, quote, "the monstrous system of Lao Tzu." And there he writes, "Sitting in dark rooms with their eyes closed, the Chinese exert themselves to think and sense their own nothingness. All this because people would like at last to have an eternal tranquility in which to rejoice, constituting for them a supposedly blessed end of all things. But really this is a concept in which the understanding is simultaneously exhausted and all thinking itself has an end." End of quote. Kant's critique of non-Christian religious practices continues to have a pernicious impact at a time where we witness a global interest in Eastern spiritual practices. Hans Urs von Balthasar, echoing Kant's position, speaks of the recent Christian turn to Asian forms of meditation as a betrayal. A more careful look at Kant's remarks on Taoist meditation cited above is called for before dismissing his position as being irredeemably Eurocentric. While Kant acknowledges an anthropologically rooted desire for eternal tranquility in this quote, it is only the meditation directed at nothingness that does not present an intellectually viable practice, according to him. The contemplation of or striving for nothingness does not live up to the claims of reflection of something specific that is indispensable for what Kant calls enlightened religiosity. Kant defended a third form of autonomy of modern higher education in addition to the previously mentioned autonomy from the family or the parents and the autonomy from the state, namely autonomy from religious authority. In a modern cosmopolitan curriculum, religious education, he claimed, needs to be subordinated to moral education. Quote, "Singing praises, prayers, and going to church should be the expression of a heart inspired by the idea of duty. One cannot please the highest being otherwise than by becoming a better human being." Here again, we perceive an internal critique of religion. Rather than being dismissive of worshipping the highest being, Kant argues that true worship needed to be accomplished by way of cultivating moral convictions. We see that Kant was thus not only critical of Eastern practices of meditation aiming at nothingness, but he was equally critical of what he perceives to be an education based on an empty application of, in this case, Christian ritual. He dismissed singing religious songs, praying, and attending church based on rote routine without a focus on pursuing morality out of conviction. Kant's critique of naive forms of religious life and spiritual practice in education is echoed in his mature proposal for university reform. In his reflections on the institutional setup of modern universities developed in the context of the faculties, Kant proposes a shift that turned out to be decisive for the development of modern higher education, at least in the Western world. He argues for replacing the traditional medieval prioritization of the faculty of theology with the primacy of the traditional lower faculty of philosophy. While philosophy used to be the mate of theology, from now on it has taken on the role of being a mediator between the validity claims of religion and the increasingly important role of the natural sciences, as well as other paradigmatic domains of modern knowledge production. Translating Kant's interventions in university education into institutional form, Wilhelm von Humboldt's On the Inner and Outer Organization of Higher Scientific Institutions in Berlin, 1809 and 10, which founded Humboldt University, became the model for this new humanist university. There, Humboldt presents the outline of the core principles behind the modern university: the unity of teaching and research, and a commitment to a substantive notion of autonomy by faculty and students alike. From now on, university education was an instruction and self-guided scientific inquiry. The claims of autonomy in higher education were to be reflected in 4 dimensions: the autonomy of the administration of the university from the state, as well as from religious authorities; the autonomy of the scholar in deciding on the content of his or her research; the autonomy of teaching and choosing the content of instruction, as well as the autonomy of the students in determining their own subjects and design specific parts of their curriculum. The emphasis on the autonomy of students was intended to cultivate a sense of intellectual curiosity and autonomous responsibility that was built on the conviction that students are not passive recipients of knowledge. They are to be treated as responsible knowledge seekers, as inquirers instead. University students are more than future professionals. For Humboldt, they are essentially co-investigators whose intellectual curiosity needed to be permitted and nurtured. The goal of reforming higher education is the creation not only of a research culture, but of a genuine community of inquiry in which a nation could represent its highest pursuits. Based on Kant's proposal, Wilhelm von Humboldt presents a foundation of the modern conception of the university that he regards as the climax of what he calls the culture of a nation. Apart from research, Humboldt considered, quote, the spiritual and moral cultivation, the geistigen und sittlichen Bildung, as the second pillar of higher education. Particularly important for Humboldt's conception of Bildung, cultivation, is the notion of Geist or spirit. The Geisteswissenschaften are, as the term suggests, spirit or spiritual sciences rather than humanities, sciences of man or liberal arts, as usually translated. They form a core pillar together with mathematics and natural sciences that cultivate reasoning according to autonomous, that is, self-reflective principles that is motivated by a concern for spiritual wholeness. Humboldt emphasizes that, quote, the procedure of our spirit, especially in its more mysterious effects, can only be explored through profound reflection and persistent observation of oneself. Self-reflection, in the sense of a creative process of self-observation and self-correction, an observation and correction both by and of spirit, results in putting oneself into a cosmopolitan perspective. It is an essential factor of the Bildung des Geistes or formation of spirit, and that this is accompanied by a cultivation of religious perspective. Humboldt adds that for this task to be successful, it is essential to consider the differences not only between individuals and their respective character and conditions, but also investigate, quote, the influence of the national character, the age and external circumstances. To counteract nationalism and narrow-mindedness, he calls for, quote, a plan for comparative anthropology that serves a double purpose: to better know and understand individual characters and to provide a philosophical manual to, quote, make judgment about their value, calculate their further developments, and estimate how they are capable to collaborate with others as a whole. Not only is such a reflective as well as comparative anthropology for Humboldt a sublime and edifying form of inquiry, it is essential to understand the interplay of diversity and unity at a global level. Quote, one does not only consider each individual peculiarity as a whole, but that all individualities are also positioned together as a whole. The modern cosmopolitan university is committed to pluralitas, diversity, as well as universitas, or wholeness, in its spiritual, political, as well as scientific pursuits. It compares different manifestations of a shared spirit at a global level. For the Kantian Humboldt, it was essential that modern university education proceed according to the principles of individual autonomy in fostering moral and spiritual maturity. Following Kant's model, religion was to be freed from its merely sentimental elements. The Protestant philosopher Kant and Humboldt were aware that religion was important in striving for personal wholeness, but they also insisted that the pursuit needed to be conducted under conditions of modernity, that is, under conditions of subjective deliberation, radical curiosity, and academic scrutiny. Rather than abandoning religion from the domain of education, it was to be transformed into what Humboldt calls an enlightened religiosity, following Kant, an aufgeklärte Religiosität. During the 20th century, the humanistic university model outlined by Kant and put into an institutional form by Humboldt was supported by another prominent defender, Karl Jaspers. In his writing The Supranational Significance of the Occidental University, der übernationale Sinn der abendländischen Universität, Karl Jaspers lays out the principle of a university that he defines in terms of a dedication to what he calls the will to truth. Jaspers identifies three principles or Grundsätze for modern institutions of higher learning, Hochschulen, that are committed to this will to truth. First, the unity of research and teaching, spiritual self-determination, as well as the pursuit of truth through independent research, as well as discussion, self-correction, and critique within the community of free and solitary inquirers. While committed to, quote, a democracy of opportunities, for Jaspers, the modern university also aims at an, quote, aristocracy of spirit that advances reciprocal recognition between nations. Quote, in this aristocracy, when it is authentic and when it emerges on the right way from talent, effort, and achievement, nations recognize each other. They themselves are what a small group of people does respectively for all, the borderless striving for truth. All educated nations want this. Reminiscent of Humboldt's university model and its double function of increasing the pride of nations and instilling a cosmopolitan spirit in citizens, the title of Jaspers' early intervention is ambivalent. While the first part, namely the supranational significance, points to a cosmopolitan vocation that emphasizes the universal conception, or the universitas, of the striving for truth, the second part of the title, namely of the Occidental University, limits its scope to its Western institutional form. Jaspers' most extensive discussion of the idea of the university is developed in the book by the same name, originally published in 1923, and significantly updated and revised and adapted to the demands of the restructuring of the university after Nazi totalitarianism and of the Second World War in 1946, and then again after the first signs of student-led reforms in the early 1960s, in 1961. According to Jaspers, Humboldt's pedagogical conception, quote, stopped halfway of being realized. The revolutionary meaning of the Humboldt model has been neglected when reducing universities to, quote, an education university with an idealist humanitarian impregnation. Existing universities violate, quote, the basic right of a thus far unrealized modern university. Instead of creating the conditions of autonomy and the existential pursuit of truth, current universities, writes Jaspers, are permanently reforming institutions that fail to bring about an authentic reform. Decades before the Bologna reforms, very important in the European context, and the increasing focus on occupational training in the highly fragmented mass university, Jaspers identifies the incapacity of contemporary universities to achieve meaningful structural changes. Rather than engaging in never-ending technocratic reformism, the Humboldt model aimed at spiritual cultivation, understood as an autonomous striving for wholeness. The existing universities failed to live up to their original claim to be, quote, the living spiritual center of the whole organization of science and formation. While the university should, according to Jaspers, also provide training for those entering professional careers, it needs to avoid being lowered to becoming an institution reduced to technical teaching for the professions. There was a debate in Germany that started in the 1920s with Tillich as well as Max Scheler, who were arguing for having two different kinds of universities, one dedicated only to professional teaching and the other one to research. But Jaspers is explicitly against these new proposals for reform and thus defends what he calls the idea of the university as being essential as an institution that continues research and teaching at the highest level and without only being tailored at professional education. Jaspers regards the university as the privileged space of what he calls spiritual existence of modern citizens, but never reconciled with the transition from the university of the few spiritual elites to that of the many. Already in his The Spiritual Situation of the Age, published in 1933, he had, drawing on the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset, identified massification as the major pathology of modern society and the modern university. His conception of spirit is significantly influenced by Humboldt and the tradition of German idealism. Jaspers is not free from elitism and an anti-modern cultural bias in this respect. Yet he also advocates the need to reclaim the spiritual vocation of universities by genuinely modern means. He emphasizes the essential aspects of freedom and spiritual existence in the will to clarification or klar werden wollen, the will to wholeness, ganz werden wollen, as well as the will to revelation, offenbar werden wollen. To live in it, in the idea of the modern university, includes the person within something whole. In ihr zu leben nimmt ihn auf in ein Ganzes. For Jaspers, the vocation of the university contribute to spiritual wholeness is an Occidental idea, eine abendländische Idee, which those who are committed to it consider being a universal idea of humanity. In contrast to Jaspers' cosmopolitan conception of world philosophy or Weltphilosophie, and the hypothesis of the axial age, namely the simultaneously and yet independent breakthrough in China, India, the Middle East, to conceptions of transcendence in different civilization centers during the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, Jaspers did not develop an equally cosmopolitan conception of education and university education specifically. The reason may be rooted in the constitutive tension between conceiving of the university as a national or Occidental institution on the one hand, and a truly cosmopolitan endeavor on the other. As we have seen, this internal ambivalence has shaped the Kantian Humboldtian model of higher education from its beginning. Ultimately, Jaspers aimed to rescue the unique feature of the modern university, which for him was the Occidental university, rather than entering into a truly open communication, a communicative strife, as he called it, with comparable institutional and spiritual developments beyond the Western world. The above reconstruction of the pedagogical ideals forged by Kant, Humboldt, and Jaspers has been necessary in order to recall the original idea of the modern university. The project of combining intellectual inquiry and spiritual cultivation has, as Jaspers observed, stopped halfway of being realized. The one-dimensional focus on career preparation has increasingly abandoned the project of spiritual cultivation. In a one-sided conception of secular modernity, universities have become reduced to being competitors who are ranked at the regional, at the national, and at the global level. This has contributed to a spiritual void and an increase of an often hostile culture of competition, ambition, and the display of knowledge, as well as meritocratic advancement that hollows out the pursuits of education as a core element of the common good. Rather than creating a community of autonomous inquiries dedicated to the pursuit of truth and spiritual wholeness, the modern university has become a marketplace for pursuing degrees that promise the advancement of careers and access to an increasingly precarious and competitive labor market. After this stage setting, let me now turn to two case studies to counter the trend to reduce universities to places of technical training by reintroducing spiritual elements and a cosmopolitan education and a concern for wholeness within a modern university curriculum. How can the adoption of spiritual elements proceed in today's world? A look at the development of educational institutions, including those outside of the West, may be helpful to broaden one's frame of reference and escape the limitations of the Kant-Humboldt-Jaspers conception of education without thereby abandoning the concern for an intellectual, honest form of modern education and spirituality. The example of Chinese academies is especially fruitful as a basis for a comparison. Not only have there been Confucian academies since the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 AD, and thus almost as long as the model of Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, in China there has also been an academy of higher learning that has taken on an analogous role to the early European universities. In contrast to the Protestant educators Kant, Humboldt, and Jaspers, it's in the West has been the early Jesuits who were aware of the existence of highly developed educational institutions in China as well as in Japan. Due to the early modern missions to East Asia, the Jesuit missionaries, usually highly educated humanist scholars, had the opportunity to become aware of these institutions and build institutions of their own. The classical Chinese, with today some 300 universities worldwide and almost 3,000 schools worldwide, the largest global network of universities cannot be reduced to national initiatives. The classical Chinese educational institutions engage in a critical exegesis of the Buddhist and Confucian classics with instruction in ritual practices that emphasize spiritual dimensions, and this was particularly fascinating for the early Jesuits. Due to their history of combining an appreciation of both cultural pluralism and the pursuit of the common good, Jesuit universities have a rich legacy of fostering global exchange of ideas and spiritual education. The first Jesuit college in Japan at Funai was founded in the late 16th century. It can still serve as a model of intercultural education. Not only did it follow the Jesuit educational plan set forth in the Ratio Studiorum of 1599 with the successive stages of humanistic studies, philosophy, and theology, that served as the model for Western Jesuit institutions. Students there were also taught to write in both Latin and Japanese and to study Western as well as Eastern spiritual traditions. Moreover, the curriculum combined a classical humanistic education, philosophy, and theology, as well as the study of Chinese and Japanese classics. The Italian Jesuit Alessandro Valignano, who oversaw the Japanese mission as well as the Chinese mission and was based in Macau and is buried there, proposed to unite or combine Western and Eastern learning. Western eruditio was to become complemented by Eastern shuimen in Chinese or gaokumen in Japanese. Valignano wrote the Catechism of the Christian Faith and commissioned compendia written by the Coimbra-trained vice-provincial of Japan, Pedro Gomez, that was translated into Japanese by Pedro Ramon. These unique transcultural textbooks were printed with the help of the Gutenberg Press, produced in Lisbon and then shipped to Japan and China in 1590. These educational manuals were developed in collaboration with Buddhist monks and read alongside classical Buddhist as well as Confucian scriptures or texts, aimed to foster a discussion about the relationship and essential differences between Eastern and Western philosophies, forms of spirituality, and enlightened religion. Most important was the focus on the Aristotelian conception of the soul and its relationship to Buddhist metaphysics of the illusory self and emptiness. Matteo Ricci Limado and his companions continued to use some of the textbooks from the Japanese mission at the Colegio de Sao Paulo, the Jesuit college in Macau, where the oldest Western-style university in China, where they were further enriched by Chinese material. These unique traces of an early modern intercultural as well as interreligious encounter were unfortunately short-lived. They lasted only until the expulsion of Jesuits from Japan in the early 17th century and 100 years later also from China, that ended the first phase of globalization with its rich interreligious as well as intercultural exchange, not only but especially in the domain of education. These early models can serve as exemplars of what a cosmopolitan education may look like, as much as they also need to be adapted to today's highly interconnected world and today's renewed interest in spiritual wholeness. Jaspers already hinted at the possibility that we are now at the brink of a second axial age revolution, a new spiritual intellectual breakthrough at a global level. This revolution would also need to be mirrored in the area of university education. Since the turn of the 21st century, there has been a spiritual revival in Chinese educational institutions that can be seen as an extension of the early Jesuit experiments. In addition to emphasizing the 5 Confucian virtues of humanity, righteousness, trust, sincerity, and ritual propriety, the focus has been on spiritual cultivation. In contemporary Chinese universities, it is common to combine elements from traditional and modern Chinese, Europeans, North American, as well as North American educational ideals within a hybrid intercultural curriculum. In this cosmopolitan educational space, Western-influenced whole-person education strives to break with rote memorization, outcome-based learning, and excessive testing that is sometimes mistakenly associated with traditional Chinese education in the West. In addition to modern scientific and profession-specific education, the 4 Confucian books and 5 classics are being also studied. In addition to an academic focus, there's also a performative dimension. The ancient texts are being performed through rhythmic chanting, which is believed to influence the moral outlook of a person and contribute to a spiritual revival. In contrast to Kant's fear, contemporary pedagogy in China does not see intellectual scrutiny and ritualized spiritual practice as irreconcilable. A newsletter of the Confucian Academy states, "Continuing to read the classics in the morning can enable our negative energy and purify ourselves. This energy, qi, and our spiritual dimension, shen, reach a state of perception and serenity. From the classics, we become aware of the roots of our culture. Through this daily exercise of reading, we enter into daily exchange with the sages." This shift in the Chinese curriculum marks a significant turn away from the fight against Confucianism and folk religions that has accompanied Chinese modernization processes. This new turn to the reintegration of spiritual elements in a public education is by no means self-evident given the anti-religious bias that has accompanied modern China. An analogous process to that of secularization in the West took place in the smashed temples, built schools, Hui Miao Ban Shui, secularization campaign during the early and mid-20th century. Modern secularization projects aiming at overcoming the Chinese spiritual practices started in late Qing China and were radicalized during Maoism with its culmination in the Cultural Revolution. As Jinting Wu and I have argued in a previous paper, the recent revival of Confucianism in modern educational spaces can be understood as a response to a spiritual void, Jingshan Kongxu, This void has been amplified in the disappearance of Maoist ideology and the simultaneous expansion of turbo-capitalism into all spheres of social life, coupled with the Chinese dreams of retaking the global center stage after 150 years of humiliation by Western powers and Japan. The leading tertiary institutions, Peking University, Tsinghua, Renmin, Fudan, offer courses and workshops on national studies that promise to offer existential as well as spiritual fulfillment. In addition to the cultivation of a spiritual and cultural self, these classes serve a new middle class as a mark of spiritual distinction and seek to balance one-sided material pursuits. The attempt at integrating classical and modern education, including spiritual cultivation, in China has distant similarities to the emergence of the mindfulness movement that we see at Western University, as one finds them particularly developed in England, Canada, and the United States. The mindfulness movement presents itself as compatible with secularism. It coincides with a romanticization of Eastern spiritual wisdom that is supposed to serve as a therapy for genuinely Western pathologies arising from the acceleration and disenchantment of the life world. It is presented as a remedy to rising stress levels and an answer to a diffuse sense of spiritual longing. The mindfulness movement does not replace but often complements a secular science-based curriculum. Yet, the fact that practices such as meditation and yoga are increasingly tolerated and even promoted in public as well as private educational institutions indicates the emergence of a different sentiment, a phase where new forms of romanticizing the East and criticizing secular Enlightenment reason go hand in hand, where previously neglected spheres of knowledge are being integrated within the new paradigm. Even though professional education and established knowledge systems still assume authority, ways of achieving spiritual wholeness promise to offer alternative remedies to unchecked fragmentation, stress, and alienation as side products of secular modernity. Yet, even though both movements seek to remedy the pathologies arising from the plural forms of secularization, they face essential limitations. The mindfulness movement, for example, draws on Buddhist notion of self-detachment, but often ignores central elements of Buddhist doctrinal teaching, such as the Four Noble Truths, the implications of karma and cyclical rebirth, samsara, that form the doctrinal basis of Buddhist religion. At worst, such practices inflate the secularized self rather than seeing through or putting the self into perspective, the original project of Buddhism. The mindfulness movement tends to ignore the teaching of, as well as the implication of, no self or anatman. Mindfulness risks being appropriated as a self-affirmative New Age spirituality that promises peace and serenity in addition to success in education and business. In analogy to the intellectual limitations of the mindfulness movement, the Confucian academies in China break with the cosmopolitanism of the concern for Tianxia, all under heaven, which is the core of classical Confucian teaching. Especially in the form of national studies or Goshui, Confucian academies run the risk of embracing a sinocentric form of politicized spirituality that provides the spiritual ideology of the rise of China, or from the Chinese perspective, the return to its rightful status as the Middle Kingdom. A brief look at these respective limitations of the Confucian revival and the mindfulness movement point to a need. There is a lack of a cosmopolitan university that reclaims the vocation of spiritual cultivation together with a modern university curriculum. Given the constellation of a search for reincorporating spiritual elements into modern institutions of higher education sketched above, what could Jesuit universities, for example, contribute? Universities with a religious affiliation have a distinctive role to play in the process, as I will suggest in the final section of this paper. This is addressed, unfortunately, more at an audience at my own university, Loyola University, rather than you, but I still read the last section. There is no doubt that the Society of Jesus continues to be the most influential Catholic teaching order with over 200 institutions of higher learning globally. The Jesuit universities provide different kinds of responses to the need for a spiritual revival from either New Age or a politicization of the spiritual, as we have seen in the case of the mindfulness movement and the Confucian academies. At the same time, they face the challenge of incorporating spirituality within a genuinely modern university, as it has been defended by Kant, Humboldt, and Jaspers. Charles Taylor draws on the legacy of Matteo Ricci or Limado and, quote, the great Jesuit experiment in China when reflecting on the possibility of what he calls a Catholic modernity. For Taylor, the advantage for us moderns is that living in the wake of so many varied forms of Christian life, we have this vast field of spiritualities already there before us with which to compensate for our own narrowness, to remind us of that we need to complement our own partiality on our road to wholeness. Taylor invites modern Catholics to look at modernity in a similar way as Matteo Ricci and his fellow Jesuits had approached Chinese culture, with a combination of bewilderment, fascination, and a search for commonality. But why should this modern advantage of spiritual diversity be restricted to acknowledging only the varied forms of Christian life as Taylor would have it? Would Catholicism not remain parochial if it explicitly or implicitly starts from the assumption that it restricts itself to Christian spiritualities? Is it not necessary to, in a radically ecumenical as well as self-reflective spirit, also acknowledge the narrowness and partiality of one's own Christian experiences of transcendence and connectedness? What does it mean to also put Christian insights into perspective in a truly interreligious and intercultural dialogue and travel the road to wholeness in a spiritually and politically fragmented world? Taylor argues with Ricci that what is required is the capacity of discernment that distinguishes the natural knowledge we all have of God and thus should be affirmed and extended from those practices that were distortions and would have to be changed. There are reasons to doubt, though, that the proposal of a Catholic modernity rather than a modern Catholicism, for example, will lead to a genuinely open dialogue at eye level with other traditions, especially with non-monotheistic spiritualities and secular humanism such as Confucianism. To prevent a new rights controversy from emerging, innovative pedagogical initiatives that foster interreligious and intercultural dialogue and cultivation are called for. This is especially true for university education. Despite the remarkable advances of Jesuit university towards intercultural and interreligious education during the time of Ricci, it is necessary to critically work through the ambivalent history of Catholic higher education. For much of the 20th century, Catholic universities have been, using Philip Glasson's expression, contending with modernity. They have attempted to resist modernization by way of striving for neo-scholastic synthesis. The principle has been navel-gazing and provincialization. Despite occasional self-critique, Jesuit universities struggled against modernity rather than searching for realizing modernity's hidden normative promises and potentials while contributing to a spiritual turn. The early episodes of an encounter between Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Islam during the first phase of globalization form an important reference point. At the same time, one should not idealize this beginning of an encounter. As Thomas Banchoff emphasizes, the Jesuits shared, quote, the axiomatic presumption of the cultural superiority of the West and its right to rule wherever it might prevail. In a related way, José Casanova points to the ambiguous legacy of the Jesuit education when diagnosing that during the subsequent second phase of globalization that started with the refounding of the society by the Pope Pius VIII in 1814, the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, underwent a process of joining the rise of nationalism by way of practicing nativist enculturation rather than an open dialogical engagement with other non-Western traditions. This led to the Jesuits losing their earlier intellectual curiosity, as well as the critical edge that had made them into a pioneering, controversial global force during the initial phase of globalization in China and Japan. Casanova rightly hints towards the possibility of building on the earlier method of accommodation during the present third phase of post-evangelizing globalization that started with Vatican II. After the main document Lumen Gentium, the integration of positive values from non-Christian traditions has become an expressed goal of the Catholic Church. Pedro Arrupe, the superior general of the society between 65 and 83, was most fervent in advancing an interreligious dialogue within what he called Jesuit internationalism. If Catholic education wishes to remain at the forefront of interpreting what the idea of the university may mean today, it needs to embrace a new Ritchie model. Thank you very much.